stop. Okay. Attendees are getting in, so we wait a bit. Hello, everybody. Okay, we're going to start maybe, and people are still getting in, but maybe wait for another minute or two. It's getting full quite quick, I must say. We already have 77 attendees. Okay, now it stopped the number. So let's start. Hello, everybody, and I hope you're doing all well in these circumstances. Welcome to this first ETUI webinar, at which we're going to talk about the recently published book, Working Under Pressure, Employment, Job Quality and Labor Relations in Europe's Public Sector Since the Crisis. The book is edited by Maarten Keune, Nuria, Elena, Ramos, Martín, and Mikkel Mailand, and two of them are with us today. Initially, we wanted to do this in our usual format of a live lunch event in cooperation with EPSU, the European Public Service Union, but for obvious reasons, we had to reorganize ourselves, and here we are now with a webinar. The book has been conceived and published before the COVID pandemic, but it has a lot of relevance for the current situation, as the speakers will explain later. And talking about the speakers, I would like to introduce them and thank them for their willingness to participate in this experiment. Maarten Keune is Professor of Social Security and Labor Relations at the AIAS-HSI Institute of the University of Amsterdam, and also a former researcher of the ETUI. He will present the general findings of the book, as he is the author of the overview chapter. Then we'll go into two specific country cases, very different from one another. Marta Kahancová, who is Senior Researcher and Managing Director of the Central European Labour Studies Institute in Bratislava, and currently guest researcher at the ETUI, will talk about her co-author chapter on Slovakia. Then Mikkel Mailand, who is Head of Research and Associate Professor at the Employment Relations Research Center, FAOS, at the University of Copenhagen, will talk us through the Danish case. After those presentations, which will last for about 40 minutes, we will have the pleasure to listen to some practice-based comments by Richard Pont, who is responsible for the coordination of collective bargaining and social dialogue at EPSU. Before I give the word to the speakers, I would like to inform you that you will be able to submit your questions by typing them down during the presentations and afterwards during the Q&A session. In order to do so, you need to open the Q&A window on the bottom of your screen. If you have specific questions to some of the authors, please specify that. And you can also upvote questions by others so that they are answered first. So without further ado, I would like to give the word to Maarten Keune with the first overview presentation. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a new experience for me to talk to an audience that I cannot see at all, but I hope it works. First of all, I wish we could have presented this book under better circumstances, not under Corona crisis circumstances, and I hope you're all doing well, in good health. As Maria already said, we thought it was a good idea anyway to organize some kind of an event to present this book, because we think it does offer us some valuable lessons for today, and I think especially for the situation in a few months' time. So today, with the coronavirus, we are sort of forced to look differently at work, and to look differently also at the value of certain professions, certain activities in our economy and in our society. And if I say value, I don't necessarily mean monetary value, but I mean value for our society. And here we see some, I think, some pretty big changes. We see this in the private sector, where suddenly we all see that without the cleaners and without the supermarket workers, without the transport workers, actually our society doesn't function, that they actually have a key function in our society. We see today, we see supermarket workers as being at the front line of the crisis. Who could have imagined this only a month ago, when I think most people hardly noticed their existence. And this is even more clear, I guess, in the public sector. The whole of Europe is now applauding for nurses, doctors, other care workers, and rightfully so, they are seen as the heroes of the crisis. There's a lot of praise for teachers and the way they move their teaching online, the way they take care of the kids of other vital professions. And also quite noticeably and in a way surprisingly, we all turn massively to our central governments, to our local governments, to our public services for information, for guidance, for financial support, and for other types of support. So it has become very clear that these professions are key to our societies, and to say it quite simply, without them there is no healthcare, no education, no social security, and no basic supplies. Now, this was of course also the case before the crisis, but at some point we will call the pre-corona era, this central role was often not so much recognized. And I think that's where our book comes in, where we can provide you with some, I think, important information, but also especially some important lessons. So the book presents a study of the public sector, and within the public sector of 3 activities: hospitals, primary education, and municipalities, in 9 EU countries: Czechia, Denmark, Germany, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, the UK, Slovakia, and France. And the book basically does 3 things. It analyzes for all of these countries and sectors what has happened in terms of public policy, in particular during and after the previous crisis, the financial crisis that started in 2008, but also in a more longer term perspective. Second, it shows how the number and the quality of jobs in the public sector has been developing, both during and after the financial crisis, and how we can relate these developments to public policy. And finally, it shows how workers in these 3 sectors have responded to changes in the number and quality of jobs through labor relations. Now, as Maria said, I will give a brief summary of our general findings. There's, of course, a lot of differences between countries and a lot of details here and there. You can find them in the book, which is freely available from the ETUI website. And after I'm finished, Marta and Mikkel will go into detail on 2 countries. Now, first of all, from a long-term perspective, we see that a lot has changed in the organization and the finances of the public sector across Europe in the last 30, maybe 40 years. And we sort of see this being linked to 2 main things. One is sort of longer term changes in ideology. Changes in ideology that include the emergence and growing strength of the discourse of permanent austerity and of demands for reduction of public deficits. It includes the new public management ideology that argues for small government, privatization, and outsourcing of public services, for market mechanisms in the public sector, and for decentralization. And we could include also the turn to capitalism in the former state socialist countries as part of the ideological changes in the last 30, 40 years that have led to a lot of different policies, government policies for the public sector. On the other hand, in the more short term, we look indeed into detail to the 2008 crisis. And this crisis was initially a crisis that arose in the financial sector, but then it's quite quickly turned into a crisis of public budgets, as governments used enormous amounts of public money to address the problems of the crisis, buying out banks, paying out unemployment benefits, supporting companies, etc., etc. This then resulted in increasing public deficits and debt, and to deal with these deficits and debts, most governments imposed quite severe austerity measures on the public sector. Now, this was to some extent, we could say, an ideological choice in line with the previous changes in ideology that I pointed to, and alternative policy options that are of course always there were often discarded. To some extent it was also imposed, especially in case of the countries that depend a lot on financial assistance, the countries that had to deal with the Troika, the EU, the IMF and the ECB, which demanded profound austerity and institutional reforms, especially for the public sector, in exchange for their support. Now, these two developments have had very strong effects on the number and on the quality of jobs in the public sector, in particular since 2008. And we see that in most countries, including in our study, in the past decade, or it's already a little bit more than a decade, first of all, public sector employment declined, leading in many places to a shortage of nurses and other care workers or of teachers. And very closely related to this, the quality of jobs suffered very much. Most importantly, because real wages stagnated or even declined, and because workloads increased strongly. So we can say, this all in a nutshell, that a significant part of the impact of the crisis was indeed put on the shoulders of public sector workers, reflected in fewer and lower quality jobs. This has made public sector work harder, has made it less remunerated, and made it less attractive for young and for older workers. It has also then resulted, of course, in a decline in the availability and a decline in the quality of public services. Now, if we then move to public sector labor relations, what we describe first of all is that even though there have been long traditions of social dialogue, of collective bargaining in the public sector in the whole of Europe, in almost all countries, governments turned to unilateral decision-making on budgets, on employment and on wages for the public sector to deal with financial pressures. And they ignored public sector workers, or they gave much less weight to dialogue and to bargaining. I think simply because they thought that austerity had a priority over social and employment objectives. Now, of course, public sector workers have not suffered from all this quietly, and we see two main changes then in labor relations, one related to representation and one related to protest. In terms of representation, we see an increasing fragmentation of the union landscape. Because in the public sector, we see more and more occupational unions emerging or growing, and they defend then the interest of particular groups, of doctors but not nurses, or of nurses but not doctors, of primary school teachers but not secondary school teachers. And these occupational unions then prosper because these groups often feel that their specific interests are not well enough defended by the traditional, broader, more encompassing sectoral national unions. And considering the circumstances, this is an understandable reaction. They saw their conditions deteriorate quite substantially. At the same time, it comes with a price. That is that solidarity between groups of workers then also declines. And in the end, this may also affect the overall strength of the labor movement. Another change that we've seen in representation is a sort of more of direct, indirect representation through the emergence of all kinds of social movements, organizations of public sector, public service users like parents, patients, students, and these groups, of course, first of all, target the availability and the quality of public services in education, in healthcare, in other areas, where they see that these services have suffered from austerity. But they also recognize quite clearly that the quality of public services is closely related to work, and that it requires sufficient and good quality public sector jobs, because if we don't have good and well-paid workers working under decent conditions, we cannot have good public services. So in this way, social movements and youth organizations have sort of taken up the cause of public sector workers as well, and we also see increasingly cooperation between movements and unions who at least see that they have a common cause and also often have common activities. Now, what we also observe, and with the possible exception of Denmark, as Mikkel will explain to us later on, is that in all other countries we see a very significant increase in protest. Protest, first of all, by public sector workers, but also by the mentioned user organizations and social movements. Protest against austerity measures for the public sector. Now, most noticeably, I guess, is the increase in strikes. There have been many public sector strikes in the last years, and even sort of groups that traditionally do not strike very much, doctors, have joined this trend. For example, there's been a quite long doctor strike in the UK, quite surprisingly in a way. Apart from strikes, there have been all kinds of campaigns, demonstrations, other types of protests to protest against austerity politics. Unions and movements and user organizations have often worked together in this, and I think for trade unions this has been quite an important source of new strength and also an important source of boosting their image with the general public. And in that sense, trade unions are now very carefully arguing all the time that they are not only fighting for better jobs, but they are also fighting for better public services. Now, I think already before our new crisis, our Corona crisis, it was clear that the new public management and austerity politics for the public sector had run up against their own limits. The permanent austerity, marketization, had really resulted in poorer availability and quality of services, and in a lot of dissatisfaction, both from public sector workers and from citizens. Now, in the present crisis, this is becoming even more apparent, of course, especially in healthcare, where we all wonder if we have enough nurses, if we have enough beds, if we have enough materials. But also in all other areas of the public sector, we see the pressure growing now. And possibly at the very, very short term today, the only thing we can do about this is emergency measures. But I think it's a good idea now already to start with a serious revaluation of the importance of public services in our society and of the role of public sector workers in delivering these services. So good public services are crucial to deal with exceptional situations like the present crisis, but also in easier times they are key for the quality of life of citizens, for social cohesion and for equality, and also for an innovative and a dynamic economy. And public services require sufficient, well-trained workers with good wages and good working conditions. So I think it's, even though we may not even have reached the height of the present crisis, I think it's good that we already start learning the lessons and from previous crises, and that we already now decided that the Corona crisis, after the Corona crisis, it cannot again be the public sector that pays the price of the crisis. And let's already decide now that when the crisis is over, that public sector workers cannot be ignored, and that social dialogue and collective bargaining cannot be suspended unilaterally by governments. And let's make sure that the present respect for the public sector workers, and of course as well for the private sector workers, for the cleaners and for the supermarket workers, continues. And that is translated into more and especially better jobs for these groups. If not, I think the discontent among them will grow even bigger than it was in the aftermath of the financial crisis. There will be more conflict, there will be more workers leaving the public sector, and public services will suffer further. Clearly, we need, after this crisis, we need different policies than we had after the previous one, different policies from the government, from the EU, from the financial institutions. And I think we should now already start debating about what these policies should be. That's my contribution for today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Maarten, for this. It was very clear, and you have also made clear how this is relevant, how this book and the findings are relevant today for the situation in which we are. Now, yes, I'll give the floor to Marta, right, to tell us more about Slovakia.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. It is also a very interesting and new experience for me to present like this. And I will also share my screen with you to show you some slides. Oops, but we have to go, sorry. Sorry, just a second. Okay, it should work now. Okay, I hope you can see my slides. I will be presenting a chapter from the book, which is presenting the case study of the Slovak Republic, and it was written together with my colleague Marta Kahancová from the Central European Labor Studies Institute in Bratislava. Before I go straight into some implications that follow up to Martin's thoughts, I would like to give you a little bit of background, because Slovakia and the developments of the public sector in Slovakia are probably not that well known around Europe. Slovakia, as a post-socialist country since the 1990s, overwent several steps, several periods when its public sector has been shaped to its current position. First of all, this was the period of democratization and depoliticization of the public sector, where some new structures were created and the education system was decentralized. Then, after 1998, we have seen some increased speed of reforms, which marked the period of Slovakia's pre-accession period before joining the EU in 2004. Here, the reforms of the public sector concentrated on improving the transparency of service provision, its effectiveness, and also a dual system of public administration has been established with some decentralized or divided competencies between state and local government. In the next period, the reform efforts were somewhat halted because Slovakia was already a member of the EU. However, in this period, we have seen accelerated reforms in the healthcare system, which were based on the process of so-called corporatization, driven by the prerogatives of new public management. As a result, the hospital system in Slovakia has been dualized, having on the one hand large state-run hospitals directly operated by central government and decentralized hospitals operated by local government units. And the reason why I'm saying this is because this dualization is extremely important in how the hospital sector and how industry relations in the hospital sector were shaped in the crisis period after 2008 and also in the current crisis. With this background, I also have to say that public sector employment in Slovakia was relatively stable, and we did not see a decline even in the crisis years after 2008. Rather, there has been an increase in the post-crisis years, which corresponds with the governmental strategy to face austerity measures rather via wage moderation than via employment losses. And again, this is an important observation to understand the processes within the industry relations of the public sector. Another crucial periods or crucial points was the introduction of distinct employment regulation for public service and for state service, whereas public service refers to public servants working in a number of subspheres, including education and to some extent healthcare, where central state service applies mostly to employees of the central government and to some categories of employees in local government. In the process of hospital transformation, which I already mentioned, we've seen that hospital workers have lost their public servant status, regardless of the fact that hospitals were run by the state. And again, this is a crucial point that has shaped the industry relations and the fate of collective bargaining in the post-crisis years. It has produced fragmentation in pay bargaining between different types of hospitals and later on increasing pressures to regulate working conditions, including wages, via legislation rather than via collective bargaining. Regardless of these changes, the structure of social partners remained stable until 2010. And after that, we have seen some changes which apply to several other European countries, and Martin has already mentioned them in terms of fragmentation, the emergence of occupational unions, but also the emergence of non-union actors, which to some extent pushed out the role of trade unions from the public space. In this context, our chapter in the book has asked or has looked at an interesting paradox. On the one hand, we have seen weakening public sector industry relations in the aftermath of the crisis. At the same time, we see a very vital structure of actors, relatively high bargaining coverage and high levels of organization. And we were interested to address in this chapter how this situation has brought some interactions with the crisis itself, how the crisis affected collective bargaining processes, the actors that are relevant, and also the quality of public services. To summarize some key findings from Slovakia, we've seen that both unions and employers associations in the public services have tolerated wage moderation, which was the strategy of the crisis. However, after years of wage moderation, the patience was declining, and we've seen some dissatisfaction escalated. And this meant that occupational trade unions became much more active. Some of them, especially the doctors' union, was active already before, but they became much more active after 2010, followed by other occupational trade unions in both education and healthcare. This has fueled a lot of uncoordinated action. So on the one hand, we've seen action of these different occupational unions, also of non-union actors, various public initiatives or initiatives which fought for the same goals as established trade unions. And then in the middle of this turmoil, we've seen the contested role of collective bargaining, which was previously well established in the public sector. In terms of the actual contribution of industrial relations actors to helping to share crisis measures, we've seen that in healthcare, trade unions directly contributed to stopping the second wave of the hospital transformation process, and also were directly involved in efforts to unify wage setting procedures of all healthcare professionals via legislation instead of collective bargaining. In education, we have seen less dramatic changes in terms of social partner strategies, whereas bargaining still remains the most important channel of their influence. However, it has been contested by the emergence of various non-union actors. And in terms of the quality of public services, there was a general perception of deterioration, which is also supported with some data. And this brought the question of the quality into the center of attention, also of not only of the government and policymakers, but also the social partners. And where links have been established between the importance of the quality of working conditions and the quality of service. Just to support this with some data, we have seen that the quality of primary education, the output or the performance of Slovak students in primary education has been declining compared to OECD averages. And in terms of hospitals, we see that wages in those hospitals that have been corporatized and outsourced compared to those that have not, and they were still operated via direct subordination to the central government, there were massive wage differences. And this has, for instance, created competition between these two types of hospitals. And a lot of tensions also in collective bargaining and in the bargaining power of the same occupational groups. So doctors in state hospitals versus corporatized hospitals or other occupational groups in these two categories. The attempt to overcome these tensions, this dualization, materialized in the 2016 legislation, which unified wage regulations, and at the same time, it further increased pressures on the quality of healthcare. In general, there have been collective efforts to improve the quality via wage regulations, via more attention to improve working conditions via legislation, but also individual pressures on quality, where individual citizens have increasingly used the service of the Healthcare Surveillance Authority, where they can file individual claims if they faced some dissatisfaction with the public service. Also, the pressure to increase quality comes from regular rankings that are published of schools and also of hospitals by different institutions. So to conclude, what we found in the Slovak case is that the crisis did have an important impact on the public services. The preferred strategy was wage moderation instead of employment cuts. And the early austerity measures were then followed by some gradual recovery steps. However, in terms of industrial relations, we have seen conflicts escalating, mobilization of trade unions via protests, petitions, demonstrations. So the discourse has moved from the bargaining table to the public space. This has happened in the framework of actors being fragmented, with an increasing role of non-union actors from civil society, which has put collective bargaining under pressure. So in general, there was also a trend for improving the quality of these services, but there was currently, and there still is, a lacking political will more wide-scale reforms. And what are the lessons from these findings from the previous crisis for the current COVID-19 crisis? This is probably a broader statement than only applicable to one country, but we can say, and Martin already said it as well, that public sector reforms were designed with good times in mind, to fit times of economic prosperity where new public management prerogatives were implemented, where hospital capacities could be lowered and really optimized to the need of the economy. However, this is not a correct approach because the public sector has to have some kind of a buffer in terms of the scope of the service, the quality of service, but also in the quality of working conditions of those who fight in the first front rows. So the situation and the trends we have observed in Slovakia after the previous crisis have left the public sector largely unprepared to face the corona crisis. The biggest challenges are, just like in other countries, limited hospital capacities, but also an unclear policy trajectory, how essential services will be secured and how measures will be implemented and by whom, by central or by local government. It also opens up new challenges for the education reform, which has been postponed, and basically there has been no massive education reform in a long period of time. And it also leads to the reconsideration of public sector views as a sheltered sector, which is not exposed to international market pressures. But this is also no longer the case, as public sector workers have been most exposed to the current crisis. And this leads us also to the redefinition of the concept of precarious work. Public sector work is becoming increasingly precarious along several dimensions. And it is, first of all, the working time and also occupational health and safety, because we hear every day that there is a lack of protective equipment and safety measures for public sector workers to be able to deliver their job. What is also important is their access to interest representation, because proper access to representation means better access to policy making, and also it improves policy effectiveness. Next to talking about challenges, the current crisis also brings some opportunities for the public sector. Social partners in Slovakia and hopefully also in other countries have new opportunities to protect public sector workers, to voice their claims, to try to actively shape the government policies, remedy policies and measures, and also push for more attention to future reforms in the public sector. And in Slovakia, this is specifically the debate about hospital stratification, but also education reforms and reforms in the local government structures. So to conclude, all the policy steps that we have seen being taken in response to the COVID-19 crisis shall account for these facts and not allow the public sector employees to again bear the burden and the consequences of yet another crisis. Thank you all for your attention, and I will be happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Marta, for explaining to us the impact that the previous crisis had in Slovakia and the lessons that we can learn from this for the situation in which we are in today. Now I'll give the floor to Mikkel to talk about Denmark.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I will just slide here. Yes. Okay. Fine. I will firstly say a little bit about how the Danish findings relates to the common themes and general findings from the book as presented by Maarten. After a very short introduction about the current corona crisis, I will focus on 4 themes: reforms for the last 15 years and since the Great Recession, effects from the Great Recession on the job level and on wages in the Danish public sector, effects on and reactions from industrial relations actors, and finally something about work intensification. About the corona crisis and the public sector overall, an agreement has been made between the government and the public sector social partners very recently. It implies that their employees before May 1st shall use up to 5 days of vacation if they have their unused vacation left. And this has been seen as a very small offer, and no layoffs or pay reductions will take place in the public sector, at least so far. Also for the municipalities, which form the major part of the Danish public sector, a bipartite agreement has been made between the employers' organizations and the trade unions about increasing time flexibility and increasing functional flexibility during the corona crisis. There's of course a need to move around employees to some extent, but that has been agreed with the trade unions. With regards to the 3 sectors we focus on in the book, the hospital sector is naturally under most pressure, but it seems that the health system is not on the edge of a breakdown, although it's of course under severe pressure. In teaching, as in other countries, we see a lot of user involvement of the parents and experimentations with new IT platforms in order to sustain the learning during the crisis. There seems to be an ongoing dialogue taking place between the government and at least some trade unions during the crisis of the corona. But it's actually difficult to estimate from the outside how close this dialogue is. And it's visible from press releases that the trade unions fear that the health of their employees is not prioritized high enough by the government. And then I want to say something about the book and the Danish chapter. With regard to the first theme, in Denmark, new public management and marketization of the public sector started already in the 1980s and speeded up in the 1990s. Importantly, the new public management reforms have often, but not always, either involved the social partners or be agreed on by the social partners themselves. Austerity measures were then introduced after 2008 on the top of these marketization reforms. And these austerity reforms were in Denmark, in the Danish public sector, tougher than, for instance, what we've seen in Germany, but much milder than what has been seen in Spain and Italy. The effect of the Great Recession on the job level has been moderate. In 2017, the number of jobs in the public sector was back on the 2008 level. However, whereas other parts of the public sector have seen small increases in job levels, the large municipal sector has seen a decrease. Also in Denmark, the public sector wage developments, they are directly linked to the private sector wages. Therefore, right after the outbreak of the Great Recession, public sector wages stagnated, but there were no wage cuts introduced. And since at least 2013, there have been real wage increases. The third theme of my presentation is on industrial relations. And you can say, although no major changes have been seen in the institutional structures of the public sector industrial relations, Denmark has followed the general path found in the book towards unilateralism, and more tense relations between the social partners. Employers have been proactive and the trade unions have been reactive in the period in focus up to 2017. There are numerous indications of this tendency, but the clearest one is the 2013 teachers' lockout, which led to trade union defeat and loss of bargaining rights over working time for teachers. Interestingly, the teachers' union was more or less left alone to fight with the municipal employers' organizations and the government. Solidarity between the unions was on a very low level at this point. The period saw also very few mass protests of those seen in other countries covered in the book. Maybe because there at that time was a very high level of crisis consciousness in the Danish population. However, after the period which is focused on in the book, at the collective bargaining round in 2018, what can be understood as a delayed employee reaction took place. The employers continued their proactive path during the negotiations, but the trade unions in the public sector had learned from the 2013 experience. They shouldered in what they called a musketeer oath under the slogan of "enough is enough." The trade union succeeded in mobilizing ranks and files, and members, due to dissatisfaction with, it became very obvious, not only the employer's demands at the bargaining table, but also the conditions in the public sectors in general. The musketeer oath, together with the government's fear of affecting the coming general election, led to a relatively successful outcome of the bargaining round in a trade union perspective. And this brings me then to the fourth and final theme of work intensification. The three sectors analyzed show variety with regard to several measures, but there's no doubt that work intensification has taken place in all three sectors. Employees are to a large extent working under pressure in the public sector, and this has contributed to the dissatisfaction aired under the collective bargaining round in 2018. Yes, this was a short Danish story. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikkel. Thank you for this presentation on Denmark. Yeah, let's turn to the more practice-based comments, which Richard Bond kindly agreed to deliver. He has followed the crisis and the impact it has had on the public sector in Europe closely. So I guess he has some things to add and to comment on. Yes, Richard, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so maybe I'll start by taking up that last comment from Mikkel about work intensification. I think that is a particularly important point, particularly relevant for our workers in health and social care. And the fundamental problem there is a major crisis in terms of staffing levels across Europe in those services. A number of our unions, well, we've certainly been, along with PSI, we've been coordinating a campaign around safe staffing levels. So some of our unions have managed to address the issue, but it's still one that faces virtually all of our unions across the sector. And highlights the facts very much that in most countries the level of staffing was already inadequate even before we faced this crisis. And that, so it's a hangover from austerity that that really hadn't been addressed and makes the current crisis that much worse. And I think you can then tie that into issues around levels of recruitment, levels of wages, and going back maybe to Martin's first point about the value of jobs in the sector. So I mean, what you saw throughout the period of austerity was a clampdown on wages. But what you also saw were in different respects, kind of random stops on recruitment across the public services, all contributing to the fact that in many cases the level of staffing was inadequate to deliver services even before the crisis we face now. And the impact on wages as well. I mean, in many cases, you're looking at services that were finding it difficult to recruit, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, facing a shortage of staff because of migration, the low level of wages there only contributing to the fact that it was difficult for those services to retain workers. But that also goes back to that fundamental point that Martin raised right at the beginning, is that in many cases you're looking at jobs which are undervalued, jobs which are overwhelmingly done by women in healthcare and particularly social care, which are undervalued. And I know Martin said it's not just about pay, but I think it is a very important element of it is pay, and it's the failure to recognise the contributions that these people are making to delivery of health and social care in normal times. The ETUI did some research for us called She Works Hard for the Money, which really focused on the undervaluation of women's jobs in public services, including some examples of what our affiliates have been trying to do at national level to get those jobs reevaluated. And clearly this is just a kind of fundamental part of any policy to deliver greater gender equality, both across the public services and across society. And I think that's one of the worrying things about what's going to happen afterwards, that while some progress has been made in this area, the risk is that if we end up again clamping down on public spending and public investments, then the people who are going to be worst affected are public service workers, and any of the progress that's been made to improve the paying conditions of those workers it end up being taking steps backwards rather than forwards. So I think that's a really important point to be made about both the long-term issue and the impact of this crisis. I think the other point again raised is about the role of public services in society, and there's a very good sentence at the end of Martin's introduction which summarises that, and he mentioned that in his presentation. It's not just about the service provision, it's about social cohesion and equality, but it's also about public services and their role in a dynamic and innovative economy. And I think that's really where you can't see how that's recognised by the European institutions. But, overwhelmingly, the approach taken is that it's public services second and it's public finance first. And what we have to do in terms of public finance is make sure we don't have what the European institutions see as excessive debt and deficit levels. That's the narrow view. That's and one that's inhibited our ability to ensure that public services have recovered from the recession. And you see the same pattern in the European semester. I mean, health and social care and many other public services are often mentioned in the country-specific recommendations. And while you might see occasional references to issues like quality and affordability, overwhelmingly, the question is about cost effectiveness. And if you have that narrow focus on cost effectiveness, then you're not preparing for the long term. You're not ensuring that there's that significant public investment in order to prepare for the kind of crises that we're now facing. And you need to have that long-term perspective and be willing to have to fund capacity that's beyond the normal needs. The fact that in so many countries you've seen closures in hospital beds is only exacerbating the situation we're now in. So we do need that longer term perspective. We need a boost to public investment and we need support for public health systems, which leads on to the next point that all of the colleagues mentioned about the impact of new public management or outsourcing and privatization. Clearly a big problem, clearly causing a fragmentation of if you like, the ability to plan across all the public services. And again, we go back to the fact that overwhelmingly it has a negative impact on workers' planned conditions. Worst of all, it's often the lowest paid, overwhelmingly women who face the impact of that, of various forms of outsourcing and privatization. And what we've shown in a recent report is actually the overwhelming academic evidence shows that there is no real difference between public and private sector efficiency. So there is no justification for this level of private sector role in what should be essentially publicly funded public services. And maybe to move on to this important issue of collective bargaining and social dialogue, I mean, you know, what it clearly was the case during austerity that there was a block on collective bargaining, some completely stopped, a weakening of the role of public sector trade unions. I think the good news really is to say that in most cases, our affiliates have ridden it out. Collective bargaining is has gradually returned to normal, if not all, if you like, not all pay and rights have necessarily been restored in all countries, but it's getting there. I think the thing to underline was that it very much a mistake. There is no reason at all why you need emergency measures that include any kind of block on social dialogue and collective bargaining. I mean, trade unions themselves understand what's needed to tackle some of these crises. I mean, it's notable that in several countries, a number of our affiliates have suspended industrial action because of the COVID-19 crisis. They realise the focus is on dealing with this crisis, and any issues around, longer-term issues around paying conditions, they'll resolve after that. But I think maybe one of the key examples from what's going on at the moment is what's happening in Italy. So during austerity, it was certainly the case that there was a complete block on collective bargaining. But what you're seeing at the moment are the trade unions fully involved in negotiating agreements that try to tackle the COVID-19 crisis, to try to address the issues about inadequate and lack of personal protective equipment. So they're there negotiating with the Ministry of Health, trying to tackle the crisis. So it's absolutely essential that unions in all countries are there to do that, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be. And it's of some concern that a number of governments, so far governments in Central and Eastern Europe, have put forward proposals for emergency legislation that could undermine employment and trade union rights. You know, it would appear that those moves in Croatia, Poland and Lithuania have been withdrawn, but we certainly see what's happening in Hungary. But it would be of serious concern to us if any government tries to weaken trade union rights at this crucial time. I mean, I think there's a recognition that some emergency measures need to be taken. In some countries, there have been changes to working time regulations, which can be crucial, particularly in health and social care. But the key thing is that the trade unions still need to be there to regulate and monitor that and ensure that there's some protection for workers. So I think they're a number of the key points I want to make, but maybe just to reiterate, I think that what the book shows is clearly the significant impact of austerity on public services and the extent to which that's now having a significant impact on how we're able to deal with the current crisis. And I really think that, the message then from there is that we can't, the aftermath of this can't be in any way like the response to the previous economic and social crisis. We need to have a completely different perspective about how we maintain and invest in our public services in the longer term, so we're more fully prepared for what's to come, and don't find ourselves really facing a crisis that we don't have the staffing and resources to cope with properly. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, well, thank you to all of you for the presentations. Now we can say we have some questions in our Q&As, which you can have a look on. But maybe start with a question that I would have, which also can be related to, I see here one of the questions by Adam Rogalewski. He's asking about the trade union density in the countries you were talking about. He's asking, has it increased as a result of the austerity measures? And are workers joining in bigger numbers unions to protect their working conditions? And I would say this is about the result of the austerity measures, but what do you think about the trade unions today in this crisis? Is this, do you see this as a window of opportunity for the trade unions to reaffirm their position as important players in the society? What do you think about it? Because we hear now some new numbers, and that people are massively joining unions in some countries now in the last weeks. What do you think? What could this mean for the trade unions? Maybe
the question to all of us, or
yeah, why not? I think it's an important question.
Maybe I can give a first comment on it. First of all, yes, I think this kind of situation leads to increase in membership, although this may often turn out to be temporary. But I think the main point here for the main opportunity for trade unions here, of course, is alliance with the rest of society. So there is such a massive support now for health workers, teachers, public sector in general, that I think this is where unions should take their chance and establish a stronger alliance with the rest of society, with all kinds of organizations, with citizens, to strengthen their position. Because I think the common cause idea is very clear now. I think we've all seen now how healthcare workers work, and we all agree that this is unacceptable. But we also run the risk that once the crisis is over, that most policymakers will forget this. So I think unions in alliance with the rest of society should make sure that this is not forgotten, and that this is actually capitalized upon by workers. And as Richard said, literally in terms of salary, and also more symbolically in terms of respect.
If I may add something to this, membership or growing membership is one of the crucial resources that trade unions have at their disposal. And what we see currently, the massive public support for public sector employees and their representatives, the unions can take this as an opportunity, or should take this as an opportunity, to strengthen not only their organizational resources in terms of membership, but also via this massive public support to strengthen their access to policymaking, their access to helping shaping the future reforms that will have to come, not only the actual working conditions in their spheres, but also more general reforms which are relevant for the whole society. So even from this research-oriented perspective, it is a very important step, and that's why we all recognize not only the challenges of the crisis, but also the opportunities it possibly brings.
Okay, Somebody else want to say something on this one? Yeah, Mikkel.
Yeah, for Denmark, I would say that if you compare to the last crisis, of course, in the public sector in Denmark, we have already a quite high level of trade union membership. But look across sector, across private and public sector, and look at the last 2008 crisis, it was expected that you could see a positive influence on membership from that. And that didn't really catch in my country, at least. And if it did, it was only very shortly. I think maybe this crisis, it's of course very early to say, but maybe it's first of all an opportunity for the public sector trade unions to pay attention to themselves and to build the alliances that Martin is talking about. So this could be that could be the window of opportunities to increase or to stop the loss of membership. But looking back to 2008 maybe doesn't give so high hopes in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Richard, you want to say something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we certainly had some reports from affiliates about increasing membership, and I think it is, I mean, taking on board some of the points already made, but I think this is a key time for trade unions. I think when you have such a fundamental health and safety issue at the core of many people's concerns, I think that is a time when unions can come into their own. It's a central element for them. So I think if they can deliver on that and provide the response to the concerns that workers have, then I think you can quite understand why there might be an increase in membership. I think the point then is that how you can turn that potentially short-term increase into longer-term support for trade unions, and that may well be where this sort of broader social issue comes in. Now, I think that again comes back to how things pan out after the crisis, and if trade unions have a key role in arguing for a different response this time, and effectively a different response, then that could also make a difference to their long-term health of the unions.
Okay, oh, that's clear. Yeah, well, if I look at the other questions, maybe one that is specifically to Maarten. How can Daria is asking, how can we use the COVID crisis to make finance pay? How can we switch from the approach that went on in 2008, that public services and the taxpayers bailed out banks and private department, the private sector probably, to making them pay this time? Would you have a...
That's literally the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I think the point is, if we look at the previous crisis, the financial crisis, when the crisis was at its height, I think we all thought, like, when this is over, things are going to change. No? We need a new system, a new ideology, a new way of cooperation between governments, a new relationship between society and finance. But I think the ideology has proven to be strong, and I think not much has actually changed in that sense after the financial crisis. I think it's up to all of us to make sure that this time it does. How do you do? And also now, and I think many of us have the feeling that we cannot go back to how it was before. We cannot go back to the public sector always being in the corner where you get the biggest hits, and where people have to work harder and harder for less and less all the time. But I'm not so sure once the crisis is over if this feeling will persist. And I think this is, in the end, a question of ideology and of politics. So it's, I think, up to all of us to go for different politics, to elect different officials or to convince the elected officials that they do different things, that we want a society that works differently. And that's not a very practical answer, but I think it's the core of what we have to think about. And I have no recipe for that, but I think this is what we have to start discussing about today.
Okay, thank you. A question to Mikkel from Dimitris. Do you have any hint that the post-COVID-19 era will further alter the organization of public sector work place with the introduction and or expansion of remote work, and which will be the consequence on public servants' working rights and unionization ability? For instance, Marta referred to the threat of precariousness. If you can also read the questions on the, do you want me to repeat it?
Yeah, can you like summarize the question? Yeah.
Sorry?
Can you summarize it?
Yeah, well, do you think that the post-COVID era will further change the organization of public sector work and the role that that remote work, so I guess telework, is having in this, and which are yeah, and the other question is on the unionization, but this I think we have already answered. So yeah, maybe the organization of public sector work, whether I think that this is maybe going in the direction of what about the use of telework, which is now being introduced without, you know, a lot of planning and without much preparation, but now it is the case. So what do you think this will do to public sector?
I think it's very early and hard to say, but I mean, in general, it's not good for the work environment, and it's not good for unionization on that matter when people work very dispersed and are not meeting. You often see that workplaces that suffer the most and where you have the weakest voice from trade unions are in those workplaces where the employees actually doesn't meet or doesn't interact. But is that what we will see from teleworking in the public sector? Maybe that's an exaggeration. But what could happen is, of course, that you find out that there are drawbacks with teleworking, but there are also some advantages, and that will create a new work environment if this is going to be used massively on a longer term. So that will be a challenge for coherence at the workplaces, and it will also raise demands of trade unions and also new health issues, I guess. But to be more specific around what kind of challenges, how telework will be used in the longer term, I think it's difficult to say right now.
Okay. Our colleague Stan is asking, in some countries we see some essential workers going on strikes right now. Supermarket workers in Belgium and the US successfully stages strikes now that their structural power is higher. Obviously that's more difficult for care workers at this moment. How could they still make the most of this situation to ensure that this public support will contribute to better working conditions and better financing of these sectors? Maybe a question to Richard?
Sorry, just unmuting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is very difficult for them in this situation to take action. Although I must say that in circumstances where they face serious risks to their health and safety, I think ultimately they still should have the right to take some kind of action, or to walk off the job, because I think that's it's absolutely pointless trying to provide a service when you're just making yourself and your colleagues ill. So I think there's an issue there where you know, as a last resort, they can still take action. I think the key thing really is the extent to which they will be in a position after this to try and, if you like, assert more strongly their rights. And it may well be that if the health and social care trade unions come out of this stronger, then they'll be in a position to try to do that. But I mean, it's going to be a major challenge for them, and it also, again, it comes back to a bit of an issue about fragmentation, because you have workers within the public service facing different working conditions. You have a growth in precarious employment, self-employment, and of course you have many workers who where organisation is much weaker in the private sector. So I think again, if one thing that emerges is the failure of the private sector to deliver, the slowing down or the reversal of privatisation, if you reduce that fragmentation, then that itself will help strengthen the trade unions. Can I just take 30 seconds to respond to an earlier question about the finance sector? And I think one of the key things that happened last time round is that the European international institutions like the IMF intervened in a number of countries to provide finance for governments, and those institutions were very good about setting conditions on those governments. So they provided balance of payments financing, they provided support to those governments with lots of conditions. I think this time round, if we're bailing out companies, then we have to set conditions for them. We have to set conditions in terms of social rights, in terms of environmental conditions, and in terms of ensuring that any company that gets any kind of public support is a company that properly pays its taxes. So I think that's the kind of thing that we really need to push to make it different this time around. Thanks.
Okay, well, we have many other questions, but I had a look and I think they're all deal with aspects that we already have mentioned here. So I think that yeah, well, we have answered them indirectly. So yes, thank you very much to all speakers that were with us today, and also to the audience to be with us during this first ETUI webinar. I would like to apologize if there have been any technical issues. We are learning by doing, and let's hope that it will only get better in the future. It was our first webinar. The slides of Marta and the recording of the webinar will be available on the ETUI website after the event. All the attendees will also receive an email with the links. Maybe most importantly, the book which we're talking about is also available for free download from our website. Thank you again, and I hope to be able to welcome you at our next events, live or online, who knows. Thank you again, and I hope to be able yes, to welcome you again, maybe this time in a live event. Let's hope this is the case for very soon. Check as well the ETUI website and social media channels to learn about all the new resources that we have developed on the social impact of COVID-19, because ETUI has not been standing still. We have many new material. Yeah, so goodbye and stay healthy. That's from me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Maria. Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye.